This is a completely true story told by Thomas about his terrifying experience. One cold evening in late autumn, Thomas moved into an old house at the edge of town. The house had been abandoned for many years, and when he stepped inside, he felt an eerie silence. The walls were thick with dust, the wooden floors creaked with every step, and the space around him seemed to be buried in darkness. The house wasn't welcoming, but Thomas was drawn to old, dilapidated houses, places that could conceal the secrets of the past. He needed a fresh start, and this house seemed like the perfect place to leave behind the troubles of his past life. This house had a strange legend. People in the town would often whisper about it, but no one dared to speak openly. The previous owners had left abruptly, and no one knew why. The house was surrounded by rumors of flickering lights, strange noises, and occasionally sightings of strange figures appearing in the windows. But Thomas wasn't one to believe such stories. He thought they were just baseless rumors about an old house. However, upon moving in, Thomas couldn't deny the strange sense of unease in the air. On the first night after unpacking his belongings, Thomas decided to explore the house. He was drawn to the large bathroom where an old mirror hung on the wall. He admired the mirror, its frame intricately carved with unfamiliar patterns. The mirror seemed to beckon him, as if it was hiding something that he needed to uncover. As Thomas stood in front of the mirror brushing his hair, he suddenly saw a shadow standing behind him. At first, he thought it was just his imagination, but when he looked again in the mirror, the shadow was tall, dark, and ominous, standing right behind him. He quickly turned around, but there was no one there. The room was empty. A chill enveloped him, as though someone was watching him. He tried to convince himself that it was just a strange reflection in the mirror, but the chill still clung to him. That night, as he left out the bathroom, a cold breeze swept through the house, and the feeling of being watched lingered. Thomas could not shake the sense that something was wrong with the house. Over the next few days, strange things began happening. Footsteps echoed through the empty house, even though no one was there. Doors would open and close on their own, and sometimes he would catch glimpses of a figure in the corner of his eye. But when he turned around, the room was empty. At night, he often heard faint whispers from the walls, as though the house was speaking to him in a language he couldn't understand. These events only heightened his unease, but Thomas tried to convince himself it was all just his imagination. However, one evening, when the knocking began, Thomas couldn't ignore it anymore. The first knock was soft, almost imperceptible, and he wasn't sure if he had heard it. He froze, listening. Another knock, this time louder and clearer. Thomas walked to the door, peered through the peephole, but saw no one. He opened the door, but the only thing outside was darkness. A sense of confusion filled him, and he closed the door, but the knocking continued, louder and louder. He opened the door again, but no one was out there. The air grew heavier, and Thomas closed the door again, a sense of dread weighing heavily on his mind. Though he tried to convince himself that nothing was wrong, he couldn't escape the feeling that something was lurking. That night, while he was sleeping, the knocking started again. But this time it was coming from all directions in the house, from the door, from the windows, from the walls, even from the floor. The sounds seemed to be everywhere, relentless. Thomas couldn't think of any reason why the house was making these noises. He called the police, but when they arrived, there was nothing unusual. They suggested it was a prank or just his imagination. But Thomas knew better. He couldn't have imagined these things, and the shadow he had seen in the hallway was a sign of something much worse. After a few days, Thomas decided he could no longer sit idly by. He had to confront the shadow. He began researching the history of the house, and the more he discovered, the more shocked he became. The house wasn't just haunted by the shadow, it had a dark past. The previous owners had left without a trace. They had only left behind a strange symbol carved into the floorboards in the living room, near the fireplace. This led Thomas to think of an ancient ritual, and after further research, he found out that the house had once belonged to Samuel Bishop, a known occultist who practiced dark rituals. It was believed that he had opened a doorway to another world, allowing malevolent entities to enter from another realm. The shadow Thomas saw wasn't a normal figure. It was the embodiment of darkness, the soul trapped within the house. And for the first time, Thomas realized that the knocks weren't random. They were a signal, a way for the evil the house concealed to reach out. But he knew that no matter what he did, the house would never let him go, unless he found a way to close the door that the mysterious man had opened so long ago. The fear rose in Thomas's chest as he stood in the cold, eerie house, the faint light from the lamps casting long shadows on the floor. Every gust of wind through the cracks in the door seemed like a whisper, urging him deeper into confusion. He couldn't just sit still anymore. The shadow, the strange sounds, all of these inexplicable things were suffocating him. He had no choice but to face them. Thomas decided to return to the living room where the strange symbol still lay carved into the floorboards. He felt an invisible pull from the symbol. Each step he took felt like a step into a world of the unknown, as if he was walking into a trap that he had unwittingly set for himself. The walls around him seemed to constrict, making it hard for him to breathe, as though some presence was watching his every move. He sat down before the symbol and gazed into it, feeling an odd sensation. At first, it seemed like a simple design, but now it seemed alive, as if it was calling him into a dark realm from which he could never escape. The shadow of Eliza's face suddenly appeared in his mind, her black eyes, her tense lips, as if she was transmitting a message to him from another world. "Help me!" Her voice echoed in his mind, and this time it was stronger and clearer than ever. Thomas could feel the urgency in her tone, as if she didn't want him to just watch, but to do something, to act. He gasped for air, his hands clenched together. As the resolve within him began to grow, he had to act. The footsteps echoed in his head, as if someone was walking with him in the darkness. Even though the room was still empty, he couldn't avoid the sensation that an invisible hand was pushing him toward the table with the carved symbol. A coldness swept over his body, causing him to shiver. The air became thick and heavy. The front door of the house suddenly slammed shut behind him, making him jump. The chill enveloped him, threatening to make him collapse, but he steeled himself and moved forward. Suddenly, a knock rang out, not from the door, but from the walls, from the floor, from everywhere in the room. The rhythmic knocking was like someone was knocking on a door he couldn't see. Then, like a storm, everything in the room started shaking. The chairs moved on their own, and the paintings on the walls began to sway. A blinding light emanated from the symbol on the floor, forcing Thomas to squint his eyes from the intense brightness. Screams and cries echoed from every corner of the house, as if the spirits of the people who had died there were all crying out for help. And then he saw it. A blurry figure, shapeless but terrifying. It stood right before him, tall and dark, like a ghost pulling his soul into the darkness. Its long, bony fingers slowly reached out toward him. Its eyes, black as deep holes, stared at him with an unsettling intensity. "You can't escape," the voice rang out in his head, cold and emotionless. "You've awakened me, and now you'll be the guide." Thomas couldn't move, his legs frozen to the floor. He felt the shadow's grip tightening, as though it was taking over his mind, pulling him into an endless void. Just then he remembered Eliza's words in his dream. It must end. The house can't remain captive. His clarity returned. Thomas remembered the ancient ritual he had studied. This house had been cursed, and the souls trapped in the darkness couldn't escape. He knew what he had to do. He lunged toward the symbol, where Eliza's shadow appeared, her eyes guiding him. He placed his hand on the symbol, and the carved markings on the floor began to glow. The entire house shook violently. Screams echoed through the space, and everything around him began to shatter. He felt an invisible force tearing the space apart, as if a door was opening, releasing the trapped souls. Suddenly, a powerful light enveloped the entire house, and the dark shadows began to dissipate slowly. The screams gradually faded. The shadow, along with Eliza's shadow, finally vanished. The house returned to silence, peaceful. Thomas stood there breathless, feeling as though he had just escaped from a nightmare. But he knew that what he had just gone through wasn't a dream. It was real, something he couldn't explain. The house was completely silent, but in his heart he could still hear the sounds, the knocking echoing. Perhaps, sometimes the doors that are open can never truly be closed.